shape. The weapon was known to German troops as the stovepipe. By the last months of the war, large numbers of Panzerschrecks and Panzerfausts had been issued to tank destroyer battalions and Panzer Grenadiers. For the first time, the infantryman had become an extremely dangerous opponent for tanks, particularly in wooded or built-up areas where cover was good. Because both weapons produced quantities of flame and smoke, the position of the user was betrayed at once, and it was vital to change location immediately after firing. The MG-42, one of the most successful machine guns ever built, had been designed in 1937. The new technology of metal stamping was then still in its infancy and had never been used to make anything quite so intricate. The idea of stamping, pressing and welding horrified traditional gun makers, accustomed to producing weapons to the highest quality. But the finished machine gun successfully passed its last field trials in the autumn of 1941. Although crudely manufactured, the MG-42 was extremely sturdy, had a very simple barrel-changing system and an exceptionally high rate of fire. In 1942, it was approved for mass production, each unit costing a quarter less than its predecessor, the MG-34. When an example was first captured by the Allies, its performance amazed ordnance experts. The MG-42 was a popular weapon with the troops of the Wehrmacht, but it did have some weaknesses. Its high rate of fire made it wasteful of ammunition, and it had a tendency to become unstable after prolonged bursts on automatic. In the last half of 1944, the German armed forces in the East had lost 800,000 men. In the West, another 780,000 had been lost or were isolated. A vast reservoir of trained and combat-hardened soldiers had simply disappeared. Amongst the German population of military age, high-quality recruits were by now all but impossible to find. And with the Reich threatened from every side, there was little time for proper training. The army tried to make sure that raw recruits were led by experienced NCOs, but the policy was impossible to implement everywhere. The problem was compounded by Hitler's insistence on constantly raising new divisions. Inexperienced and barely trained formations got the best available equipment, while surviving veteran divisions at the front were badly neglected. Their losses in men and weapons rarely made good. In one winter month, when 26,000 machine guns were delivered by German industry, only 1,500 went to frontline formations. The rest went to newly formed units. Only the top divisions of the party army, the Waffen SS, were favoured with anything like adequate replacements of men or equipment. As Adolf Hitler's mistrust of the German army's officer corps had deepened, he had grown more and more convinced that party loyalty, fanatical obedience and ideological purity were of far greater importance than professional competence. After the bomb plot of July 1944, Hitler had made SS chief Heinrich Himmler commander of the replacement army. Himmler, with virtually no military experience, now controlled all military forces inside Germany and was in charge of the training of all new formations. The ultimate encroachment by the Nazi Party in military affairs came with the raising of the German Home Guard, the Volkssturm. The Volkssturm was to be controlled not by the army, but by the party. Enlistment in the Volkssturm was compulsory for all males between the ages of 16 and 60 not already in military service. Poorly equipped, with little training, and led by men selected for their Nazi credentials, the Volkssturm was expected by Hitler to fight alongside the army. As military units, however, Volkssturm detachments would be largely ineffective, and in the eyes of the regular army, boys and old men thrown heedlessly into battle could only be a tragic and dangerous liability. As 1944 turned to 1945, the German army in the West was still embroiled in Hitler's doomed adventure in the Ardennes. The Führer continued to dismiss all warnings of an imminent Soviet offensive, and was even planning another major attack on the Allies. The limit of his interest in the Eastern Front was the plight of the Hungarian capital of Budapest, by now surrounded by the Red Army. Obsessed with Hungary's oil fields, Hitler had first designated Budapest as a Festung, a fortress to be defended to the last man, and then, to the horror of his high command, he had ordered 2 powerful SS divisions to be stripped from the eastern reserves and sent south to relieve the city. Meanwhile, along the central sector of the front, far from Budapest and its beleaguered garrison, 200 Soviet divisions were poised to thrust at the very heart of Hitler's Germany. In preparing for its great assault on the German heartland, the Red Army faced formidable obstacles. The jumping-off points were 3 bridgeheads the Soviets held on the west bank of the river Vistula, and the railway networks which could supply them had been shattered. Enormous effort had to be expended repairing the lines, and in particular the bridge at Sandomierz, from whence the first Soviet blow would be struck. By the first week in January, the flow of supplies and equipment to the 2 main Russian fronts had turned into a torrent. For the offensive, the Red Army had mustered almost 2.5 million men and 6,500 tanks, half of its entire armoured force. The massive Soviet build-up was still far from complete when, from London, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote to Stalin. Churchill begged that the Soviet Union launch an attack as soon as possible, to ease German pressure on the Allies in the West. Stalin had scheduled the start of the offensive for the 20th, but he agreed to change the timetable. The attack would begin on January the 12th. The opening blow in the Great Offensive was to be struck by Marshal Konev's First Ukrainian Front. Konev had massed 500 guns for every mile of his front line,